The sun clawed at the earth, scorching the cracked plains until they bled dust. Her boots scuffed against the parched ground, each step a small rebellion against the weight of her body. Eleanor's breath rasped, thin and sharp, like a blade scraping bone. The canteen at her hip slapped empty against her thigh, a useless pendulum. She'd come from St. Louis on a promise, a letter crumpled in her pocket, its ink smeared from sweat and hope. A widower named Amos had begged for a wife to mother his boys, his words raw with need. She'd answered, alone, with nothing but a battered trunk and a heart stitched with fear. Now, the horizon mocked her, flat and unbroken, offering no sign of the ranch he'd described. Just heat, and the faint hum of cicadas, pulsing like a fever. Her knees wavered, but she pressed forward, skirt catching on sagebrush. The air smelled of baked clay and something sour, like regret. She'd left behind a boarding house life, mopping floors, dodging men's hands, for this. For a man she'd never met, for boys she didn't know, for a place that might not exist. The letter had promised a home, a purpose. But the stagecoach had dropped her at a crossroads, miles from anywhere, with only a driver's grunt and a cloud of dust for farewell. Her shadow stretched long and thin, a stranger trailing her. She stopped, swaying, as a hawk screamed overhead. Its wings cut the sky, sharp and indifferent. Her throat burned, dry as the earth beneath her. She'd imagined Amos waiting, hat in hand, his boys shy but eager. Instead, there was nothing. No wagon, no hoofbeats, no voice calling her name. Just the wind, whispering lies. She sank to her knees, hands digging into the dirt, fingers clawing for something solid. The ground gave no comfort, only grit that stung her palms. She thought of her mother's hands, rough from laundry, and the way they'd trembled when she'd said goodbye. "You're chasing ghosts, girl," her mother had whispered. Eleanor had left anyway. Her vision blurred, the horizon shimmering like water she couldn't reach. She tried to stand, but her legs betrayed her, heavy as stone. The hawk circled again, closer now, its shadow brushing her like a warning. She clutched the letter, its edges soft from her touch, and pressed it to her chest. Amos's words swam in her mind, 2 boys, wild as colts, need a woman's hand. I'm no good alone. She'd pictured a hearth, laughter, a table set for 4. Now, she saw only the endless plain, swallowing her whole. A sound broke the silence, hooves, steady and real. Not thunder, not memory. She lifted her head, squinting against the glare. A figure emerged from the haze, a man on horseback, his silhouette jagged against the sun. He rode slow, deliberate, a rifle slung across his back. Her heart kicked, fear and hope tangling like thorns. She tried to call out, but her voice cracked, lost in the wind. The rider stopped a few yards off, his horse snorting, hooves stirring dust. He dismounted, boots crunching, and crouched before her. His face was weathered, eyes like slate, unreadable. "You Eleanor?" he asked, voice low, rough as gravel. She nodded, throat too dry to speak. He didn't smile, didn't offer a hand. Just studied her, like she was a calf strayed too far from the herd. "Amos sent me," he said finally. "Ranch is a day's ride. You look half dead." He pulled a canteen from his saddle, held it out. She took it, hands shaking, and drank. The water was warm, metallic, but it slid down her throat like mercy. He watched her, silent, then stood. "Can you walk?" She forced herself up, legs trembling but stubborn. The plain stretched on, vast and cruel, but the man's presence was an anchor, solid in the emptiness. She didn't know him, didn't trust him, but he was here. That was enough for now. The hawk screamed again, circling, and she felt its shadow pass over her heart. The stranger's name was Caleb, and he spoke little as they moved across the plain. His horse plodded beside her, its breath steaming in the cooling air. Eleanor's legs ached, each step sinking into the earth like a plea. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruises of orange and purple. Dust clung to her skin, gritty against her lips, and the letter in her pocket felt heavier than the trunk dragging behind her. Caleb hadn't offered to carry it, though his eyes flicked to it once, curious or suspicious, she couldn't tell. He walked with a limp, faint but there, his left boot scuffing unevenly. She wondered what broke him, but the silence between them was a wall, and she didn't dare climb it. Her mind drifted to the boarding house, to nights spent scrubbing floors until her knuckles bled. The men there, with their whiskey breath and wandering hands, had taught her to keep her eyes down, her voice small. But Amos's letter had been different, clumsy, almost desperate, written in a hand that shook. The boys are 7 and 9, full of fire but no mother to guide them. I'm drowning, Eleanor. Come quick. She'd read it by lamplight, her heart racing at the thought of being needed. Not wanted, but needed. She'd packed her mother's old shawl, a Bible, and a single dress she'd mended too many times. Now, trudging beside Caleb, she wondered if need was just another kind of trap. The land began to rise, the flat plain giving way to low hills studded with mesquite. A dry creek bed snaked through the earth, its banks cracked like old skin. She stumbled, her boot catching a root, and Caleb's hand shot out, steadying her elbow. His grip was firm, calloused, but he let go quick, like touching her burned. Watch your step, he muttered, eyes on the horizon. She nodded, swallowing the thanks that stuck in her throat. The air grew sharp, carrying the scent of sage and something faint, wood smoke, maybe, or hope. Her thoughts flickered to a memory, unbidden. Her mother, kneading dough in their cramped kitchen, flour dusting her apron like snow. Men promise the world, Ellie, she'd said, her voice worn thin. But they give you their burdens instead. Eleanor had been 16, already taller than her mother, but still small in her shadow. She'd wanted to argue, to say not all men, not always. But her father's absence hung between them, a ghost neither named. Now, with Caleb's silence and the endless land, her mother's words felt like prophecy. They crested a hill, and a ranch came into view, squat and weathered against the dusk. A low house, its wood grayed by sun and wind, crouched beside a barn that leaned slightly, as if tired. A corral held 2 horses, their heads low, tails flicking. No laughter, no boys running to greet her. Just a faint glow from a window, flickering like a heartbeat. Caleb stopped, tying his horse to a post. Amos is inside, he said, not meeting her eyes. He don't come out much. There was something in his voice, pity, maybe, or warning. She clutched her trunk's handle, the wood biting her palm. The door creaked as Caleb pushed it open, revealing a dim room heavy with the smell of grease and unwashed wool. A man sat at a table, shoulders hunched, a bottle in his hand. His hair was dark, streaked with gray, and his eyes, when they lifted, were bloodshot, hollow. Amos, she knew, though he looked nothing like the man she'd imagined. No strength, no warmth. Just a shell, worn thin by grief or guilt. 2 boys stood behind him, their faces smudged with dirt, eyes wide but wary. The younger one clutched a wooden horse, its legs chipped. The older stared at her like she was a storm rolling in. You're late, Amos said, voice slurred, thick with whiskey. He didn't stand, didn't smile. Eleanor's heart sank, but she straightened, brushing dust from her skirt. Stage was late, she said softly, her voice steadier than she felt. The room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in. Caleb lingered by the door, his shadow long across the floor. The boys said nothing, but their eyes followed her, sharp as knives. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the scent of coming rain. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her shadow pooling on the warped floorboards. The room's air was thick, sour with whiskey and neglect. Amos's eyes lingered on her, not curious but dull, like he was seeing through her to something already lost. The boys shifted behind him, the younger one, Samuel, she'd later learn, clutching his wooden horse tighter, its chipped edges catching the lamplight. The older, Jacob, crossed his arms, his jaw set like a gate locked shut. Caleb cleared his throat, still by the door, and the sound was a nudge, pulling her forward. She set her trunk down, the thud echoing in the quiet. Her hands shook, but she clasped them behind her back, hiding the tremor. The house was a husk, its walls stained with time and smoke. A single shelf held a cracked pitcher, a tin cup, and a Bible, its cover worn to threads. The hearth was cold, ashes scattered like forgotten promises. She'd imagined a home, warm with life, but this was a place where things came to die. Amos took a swig from his bottle, the liquid glinting amber. "You cook?" he asked, words slurring into one another. She nodded, though her stomach twisted. She hadn't cooked for anyone but herself in years, and even then, it was scraps, not meals. "Good," he said, leaning back. "Boys need feeding. Start tomorrow." Samuel's eyes flicked to her, quick as a sparrow, then away. Jacob didn't move, his stare hard and unyielding. She wanted to speak to them, to say something soft, something that might bridge the gap, but her throat was dry as the plains outside. Instead, she knelt by her trunk, pulling out her mother's shawl. Its frayed edges brushed her fingers, and for a moment, she was back in St. Louis, her mother's voice humming a hymn, low and steady. The memory stung, sharp as a thorn. She stood, draping the shawl over her arm, and caught Jacob watching her, his eyes narrowing like he'd seen a weakness. Caleb stepped forward, his limp more pronounced in the cramped room. "She needs a bed," he said to Amos, voice flat but firm. Amos waved a hand, dismissive. "Barn's got space. Hay's soft enough." Eleanor's chest tightened, but she kept her face still. The barn. Not a room, not a welcome. Just another place to be alone. Caleb's jaw twitched, but he didn't argue. He nodded to her, a silent order to follow, and she did, her boots scuffing the floor. The boys watched her go, Samuel's fingers tightening on his horse, Jacob's gaze burning into her back. Outside, the air was sharp, the sky now a deep indigo pricked with stars. The barn loomed ahead, its slats warped, letting in slivers of moonlight. Caleb pushed the door open, revealing a dark space that smelled of hay and horse. A lantern hung on a nail, and he lit it, the glow casting shadows that danced like ghosts. "It's dry," he said, not looking at her. "Warmer than it looks." She nodded, setting her trunk against a stall. The hay crunched underfoot, and a horse snorted softly in the dark. She thought of the boarding house, its thin mattress and leaking roof, and told herself this was no worse. But the lie felt heavy, like stones in her pockets. Caleb lingered, his silhouette framed by the door. "Amos ain't always like that," he said, voice low, almost reluctant. "He's broken. Since Clara." He didn't explain, didn't need to. The name carried its own weight, a shadow that hung over the ranch. Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure why. She didn't know Clara, didn't know Amos, didn't know if she could fix what was broken here. Caleb turned to go, then paused. "Boys are good," he said. "Just scared. Like you." The words landed soft, but they cut. He left without another word, the door creaking shut behind him. Eleanor sank into the hay, the shawl pulled tight around her. The barn was quiet, save for the rustle of mice and the distant howl of wind. She thought of her mother's warning, of Amos's hollow eyes, of the boy's silent judgment. Fear coiled in her chest, but beneath it, something stubborn stirred. She'd come this far, crossed a continent for a promise. She wouldn't break now. The stars outside gleamed, cold and distant, but they were there. She held on to that, small as it was. Morning broke sharp and cold, the sky a pale wound above the hills. Eleanor woke to the creak of the barn door, her breath clouding in the chill. Her body ached, hay clinging to her skirt, and the shawl offered little warmth against the dawn's bite. She stood, brushing off the stiffness, and stepped outside. The ranch was still, the house a gray smudge against the light. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and hesitant, like it wasn't sure it belonged. She clutched her mother's Bible, its weight a small anchor, and walked toward the house, her boots crunching frost-kissed earth. Inside, the air was warmer but no kinder. Amos was gone, his chair empty, the bottle still on the table, half drunk. The boys sat at the hearth, Samuel poking at the fire with a stick, Jacob sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. They didn't look up as she entered, but the air shifted, taut as a bowstring. She set the Bible on the table and moved to the stove, its iron belly cold. A sack of flour sat in the corner, a tin of lard beside it. She'd make biscuits, she decided, something simple, something she couldn't ruin. Her hands moved on instinct, mixing dough, though her fingers fumbled, unused to the task. The memory of her mother's kitchen came again, unbidden. Flour-dusted hands, the rhythm of kneading, the hum of a hymn. "You gotta put your weight into it, Ellie," her mother had said, pressing her palms into dough. "Else it won't rise." Eleanor had laughed then, young and sure the world would bend to her. Now, her hands trembled, the dough lumpy under her touch. She glanced at the boys, hoping for a sign, a word, a glance, but Samuel kept his eyes on the fire, and Jacob's knife scraped louder, a warning. She shaped the biscuits, uneven and small, and set them in a pan. The fire hissed as she stoked it, the heat stinging her face. The room stayed silent, save for the crackle of wood and the knife's steady rhythm. When the biscuits were done, their edges golden but hard, she set them on the table. Samuel looked up, his wooden horse forgotten in his lap. Jacob didn't move, but his knife paused. "Eat," she said, voice soft, almost lost in the quiet. Samuel hesitated, then took one, nibbling like a mouse. Jacob ignored the plate, his eyes fixed on her, sharp and untrusting. The door banged open, and Amos stumbled in, his coat dusted with frost. His face was gray, eyes red-rimmed, but he moved with purpose, grabbing a biscuit without a word. He bit into it, chewed once, and spat it into the fire. "Tastes like dirt," he muttered, tossing the rest aside. Eleanor's chest burned, but she kept her face still, her hands folded tight. Samuel froze, biscuit halfway to his mouth. Jacob's knife resumed its scraping, slower now, deliberate. Amos didn't look at her, just grabbed his bottle and slumped into his chair. "Do better tomorrow," he said, voice flat. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she cleared the table, her movements slow, precise, like she could hold herself together through sheer will. The boys watched, Samuel's eyes wide, Jacob's narrowed. She felt their judgment, heavy as the plains dust. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and she thought of the hawk from yesterday, its shadow circling her heart. She'd come to nurture, to build something, but this house felt like a grave, and she was digging it deeper with every step. Caleb appeared at noon, his limp softened by the daylight. He carried a sack of potatoes, setting it by the stove. "For supper," he said, glancing at the boys. "They like 'em boiled." She nodded, grateful for the task, for the distraction. As she peeled the skins, the knife slipping in her tired hands, Caleb lingered. "Don't mind Amos," he said quietly. "He's worse when he's sober." She met his eyes, searching for something, kindness, maybe, or truth. His face gave nothing away, but his hand brushed hers as he passed, brief and accidental, a spark in the cold. She boiled the potatoes, the steam rising like a prayer. The boys ate in silence, Amos already gone again, his bottle with him. Jacob pushed his plate away, half-eaten. Samuel finished his, eyes on his horse. Eleanor sat, her own plate untouched, and watched the fire die. The wind howled outside, carrying the scent of frost and something sharper, like change. Days bled into weeks, the ranch a rhythm of frost and dust. Eleanor learned the house's creaks, the boys' silences, the weight of Amos's absence. She slept in the barn, the hay her bed, though Caleb brought a blanket one night, wordless, leaving it folded by her trunk. Her hands grew rough from hauling water, chopping wood, kneading dough that never quite rose right. The biscuits improved, though Amos still grunted at them, his bottle ever present. Samuel began to linger near her, his wooden horse trailing across the table, leaving faint scratches. Jacob kept his distance, his knife always close, his eyes like a storm waiting to break. She found small victories in the routine: potatoes boiled soft, a stew thickened with flour, the fire kept alive through the night. The boys ate, though Jacob's plate was often left half full. One morning, Samuel left his horse on the table, its chipped legs pointed toward her like an offering. She touched it, her fingers tracing the worn wood, and saw him watching from the doorway, his face soft for the first time. "It was Ma's," he whispered, then fled. The word Ma hung in the air, heavy as smoke, and she felt Clara's ghost settle deeper into the walls. Her past crept in at night, when the barn was quiet and the stars pressed close. She remembered her father's boots by the door, always ready to leave. He'd been a preacher, his voice fire and brimstone, but his hands were cold, his promises empty. "God's got a plan, Ellie," he'd say, before disappearing into saloons or strange towns. Her mother had waited, scrubbing floors to feed them, until her hands were raw and her heart was ash. Eleanor had sworn she'd never wait for a man, yet here she was, tethered to Amos's need, to boys who didn't want her, to a ranch that felt like a cage. One evening, as snow dusted the hills, she found Jacob by the corral, whittling a stick into nothing. The air was sharp, smelling of pine and coming winter. She approached, her breath clouding, and held out a tin cup of coffee, steaming in the cold. He didn't take it, but he didn't turn away either. "You ain't our Ma," he said, voice low, cutting. She nodded, the words stinging but true. "I know," she said, setting the cup on the fence post. "I'm just here." He looked at her then, his eyes searching, and she saw the boy beneath the anger, scared, small, lost. She walked away, leaving the coffee, its steam curling like a question. Caleb became her shadow, quiet but steady. He fixed the barn's roof when it leaked, brought her wood when the pile ran low. Once, he showed her how to mend a fence, his hands patient as he guided hers. "You're stronger than you look," he said, and the words landed soft, like snow. She wanted to ask about Clara, about Amos, about the boys, but his silence held her back. Instead, she watched him, his limp a story he didn't tell, his eyes carrying a grief she recognized. The crossroads came on a night when Amos didn't return. The boys sat by the fire, Samuel clutching his horse, Jacob's knife still. Eleanor cooked, her hands steady now, the stew thick with potatoes and a bit of salt pork Caleb had brought. They ate in silence, but it was softer, less jagged. When the plates were cleared, Samuel stayed, his small hand brushing hers as he passed. "It's good," he mumbled, eyes on the floor. Jacob said nothing, but he didn't leave either. She felt the weight of their need, heavy but not crushing, and wondered if she could carry it. Outside, the snow fell thicker, blanketing the plains in quiet. She stepped onto the porch, her shawl tight around her shoulders, and watched the flakes dance in the lantern's glow. The hawk was gone, its shadow no longer circling. She thought of her mother, of her father's empty boots, of the letter that brought her here. She could leave, walk back to the crossroads, find a stage to somewhere else. But the boys' faces, Samuel's shy glance, Jacob's guarded stare, held her. She wasn't their mother, but she was here. The wind whispered, carrying the scent of snow and something new, like hope. Winter settled over the ranch like a heavy coat, snow piling against the barn and frosting the windows. Eleanor's hands grew steady, calloused from work, her breath no longer catching at Amos's slurred dismissals. The boys softened, slowly, like ice melting at the edges. Samuel took to sitting near her while she cooked, his wooden horse galloping across the table, leaving trails in the flour dust. Jacob still held his knife close, but his glares softened into glances, his silences less sharp. Amos was a ghost, in and out, his bottle a constant shadow. When he spoke, it was to demand or complain, but Eleanor learned to let his words slide off her, like snow off a slanted roof. One afternoon, as she hauled water from the creek, the ice cracked under her boot, soaking her to the ankle. The cold bit deep, and she stumbled, the bucket spilling. Caleb was there, quick despite his limp, pulling her up with a hand under her arm. "Careful," he said, his breath clouding, his eyes meeting hers for a moment longer than needed. He took the bucket, filled it, and carried it back, his shoulder brushing hers as they walked. She felt the warmth of him, fleeting but real, and something in her chest stirred, fragile as a new flame. She pushed it down, afraid of its heat. At night, she read to the boys from her mother's Bible, her voice soft against the wind's howl. Samuel leaned close, his head nearly touching her arm, listening to stories of floods and miracles. Jacob sat apart, whittling, but his hands stilled when she read, his eyes on the fire. Once, she caught him mouthing the words to a psalm, like he'd heard them before, in a voice not hers. Clara's, she guessed, and the thought was a needle in her heart. She wasn't their mother, but she was weaving herself into their days, thread by thread. The resolution came quietly, not with a fight or a revelation, but in the smallness of a moment. It was early spring, the snow melting into mud, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Eleanor was kneading dough, her hands sure now, when Samuel slipped into the kitchen, holding something behind his back. He hesitated, then held out a new wooden horse, freshly carved, its lines smoother than the old one. "For you," he said, eyes on the floor. She took it, her fingers brushing his, and saw Jacob in the doorway, his knife still, his face unguarded for the first time. "He made it," Samuel added, voice proud. She set the horse on the table, its legs steady, and felt her throat tighten. "Thank you," she said, looking at Jacob. He nodded, quick and sharp, then turned away, but not before she saw the flush on his cheeks. Amos was gone again, his chair empty, but the house felt fuller, the air lighter. She baked the bread, its crust golden, and the boys ate every slice, their plates clean. Caleb joined them, his presence a quiet anchor, and when his hand brushed hers passing a dish, she didn't pull away. Later, she stepped outside, the dawn light spilling over the plains, turning the mud to gold. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and new grass. She held the wooden horse, its weight a promise, and thought of the letter that brought her here, its ink faded but its words still alive. "I'm no good alone." Amos's need had pulled her across a continent, but it was the boys, and maybe Caleb, who held her now. She wasn't their mother, wasn't Amos's wife, wasn't sure what she was. But she was here, and that was enough. The horizon stretched wide, no longer mocking but waiting, its edges soft in the morning light. She thought of her mother's hands, her father's boots, the hawk's shadow that no longer circled. The plains were still harsh, the wind still sharp, but they carried a warmth now, faint but growing. She pressed the horse to her chest, its edges smooth against her palm, and felt the dust of the plain settle, not as a curse, but as a place to stand.